Melissa Wyatt thought she buried her husband and son 12 years ago. Daniel and young Luke vanished during a canoe trip and were presumed drowned, until a photo arrived in her mailbox, showing them very much alive. What began as a tragic accident would unravel into a chilling story of betrayal, deception, and a hidden life built on lies. Melissa had grieved, but now she would uncover a truth far darker than death. The man she loved had never died. He had disappeared on purpose, and he hadn't gone alone. Daniel Wyatt and his 10-year-old son, Luke, left their small Oregon town one July morning in 2008 for what was supposed to be a peaceful canoeing trip on Clatsop Lake. The sky was clear, the water was calm, and Daniel had packed their usual supplies: sandwiches, fishing rods, and a camera he always brought along for these bonding moments. They had done this trip many times before. To their neighbors, it was just another father and son adventure. Melissa Wyatt, Daniel's wife and Luke's mother, waved goodbye from their porch, expecting them back before dinner. When night fell and there was no sign of them, Melissa's concern turned quickly into panic. She called Daniel's phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried to convince herself that maybe they lost track of time, maybe they were just camping overnight by the lake. But when morning came with no return, she drove to Clatsop Lake herself. There, she found their red SUV parked exactly where Daniel had said it would be. The trailer was empty, the canoe missing. She waited by the car for hours, scanning the shoreline, calling their names. Still nothing. By noon, she called the police. A search and rescue team was sent out. Boats, divers, and helicopters swept the area. That evening, the canoe was spotted capsized near a rocky edge of the lake. It had damage on one side, like it had struck something. Nearby, they found Daniel's wallet floating in the water, along with what appeared to be part of a child's life jacket. There were no bodies, no footprints, and no further signs of where they might have gone. Investigators concluded that Daniel and Luke had drowned in an accident. The lake was known to have hidden underwater currents and sudden drop-offs. Even experienced swimmers had been lost in it before. The local news ran the story for weeks. Father and son vanish on Clatsop Lake. Memorials were held. Melissa, devastated and unable to accept it, refused to hold a funeral. She clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, they were alive somewhere. But with no leads and no further evidence, the case faded from public attention. For Melissa, the grief never did. Their home became a museum of what once was. Luke's bedroom was left untouched. Daniel's toothbrush still sat in the bathroom holder. She couldn't bring herself to sell the SUV, even though it sat in the garage collecting dust. Time moved forward, but she didn't. Every day, she replayed the possibilities in her head. What if they had been taken? What if Daniel had gone after help and gotten lost? What if they were still alive and needed her? Family and friends urged her to move on, but Melissa couldn't. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Daniel had been careful, always cautious. On the water, he wouldn't have let Luke go without a proper life jacket. And Luke was strong for his age, an excellent swimmer. It just didn't make sense. Still, with no new evidence, there was nothing to go on but silence. Years passed. Melissa stopped attending neighborhood gatherings, stopped smiling in photographs. Her world had shrunk to the confines of her home and the memories that lived inside it. She worked from home, barely socialized, and only kept in touch with a few close relatives. On the outside, she looked like a grieving widow learning to live with heartbreak. On the inside, she was stuck in time, waiting for an explanation she feared would never come. Then, in the 12th year of their disappearance, something changed. A letter arrived. There was no return address, just her name handwritten on the front. Inside was a single photo. Two men, one older, one younger, standing beside a dusty van in what looked like a desert. The older man bore an unmistakable resemblance to Daniel. The younger man had Luke's eyes, only older, hardened, and distant. On the back of the photo, scribbled in blue ink, were 5 chilling words. "They're alive. He lied to you." Everything Melissa thought she knew began to unravel. Melissa stared at the photograph for hours, her fingers trembling as she ran them along the edges. The faces haunted her. One man in his early 50s with sun-darkened skin and silver streaks in his beard. The other a young man who looked barely into his 20s, with a hollow gaze that seemed far older than his years. The resemblance was impossible to deny. It was them. It was Daniel and Luke. Alive, somewhere in what looked like a desert, standing in front of an old white van with cracked windows and peeling paint. The note on the back didn't offer any details, just a cruel, chilling sentence that shattered her entire understanding of the last 12 years. She brought the photo to the local police, who initially dismissed it as a hoax. But Melissa pushed. She insisted on opening the case again, reminding them there had never been any bodies, only a wallet and a torn life jacket. The lead investigator, curious but skeptical, agreed to send the image to forensic analysts. Aging software was used to compare the older man's features with Daniel's driver's license photo. The match was not exact, but the probability was high. Luke's features, aged with software, matched even more closely. That Melissa's grief turned into something else: confusion, anger, suspicion. Why would Daniel fake their deaths? Why leave her behind to suffer for more than a decade? She hadn't remarried. She had never even considered it. Her life had been frozen in time while he was apparently alive, somewhere, with their son. It felt like betrayal layered on top of loss. Detectives dove into Daniel's past once again. This time, with the theory of a staged disappearance in mind, they uncovered strange patterns that had previously gone unnoticed or unconnected. In the 2 weeks before the canoeing trip, Daniel had transferred large amounts of money from their joint savings into 2 separate accounts under different names. These accounts had gone dormant after the summer of 2008, but the funds had vanished. There was also an active life insurance policy that Daniel had purchased only months before the trip. Oddly, he had nominated Melissa as the sole beneficiary, but hadn't taken the necessary steps to have the policy paid out, perhaps knowing that no bodies would ever be found. At the time, the lack of physical remains had blocked any claim from being processed. Another odd discovery emerged. Daniel had recently been under investigation at work for suspected embezzlement. He had been a mid-level manager at a logistics company and was being audited by the firm's internal accountants when he vanished. The timing, in hindsight, was no longer coincidental. Investigators now believe that Daniel had likely decided to flee rather than face legal consequences, dragging Luke with him in the process. Melissa felt sick. She thought about the day they left, how Daniel had hugged her a little tighter than usual. She had mistaken it for love. Now she wondered if it had been guilt. Luke, just a child at the time, had likely been manipulated or coerced. There had been no signs of trouble in their marriage. No signs that Daniel was capable of something so elaborate and heartless. The search widened. Federal authorities were brought in, and Daniel's face, digitally aged, was circulated among agencies. But 12 years is a long time to stay hidden, and it was clear Daniel had planned this disappearance meticulously. He hadn't just run away. He had erased himself. Then came a breakthrough. A mechanic in a small New Mexico town contacted authorities after seeing the circulated image. He claimed to have worked on a white van that matched the one in the photo. The man who brought it in used cash, was quiet, and always traveled with a younger male who didn't speak much. The mechanic remembered the older man calling the boy Lucas. He didn't think much of it until he saw the image on the news. It had been about a year ago, he said. They had only come twice. That tip, vague but promising, reignited the investigation. The FBI began focusing on areas in New Mexico and Arizona known for isolated living and off-the-grid communities. These were places where people could vanish. By choice, supported by underground networks of survivalists or those avoiding government surveillance. Melissa, meanwhile, found herself caught between hope and rage. If Luke had been alive all these years, had he thought about her? Had he been kept away by force? Or had he simply forgotten her? She couldn't stop thinking about the message on the back of that photo. He lied to you. Who had sent it? And why now, after all these years? She began to wonder if Luke was the one who sent it, reaching out in the only way he could. The desert search was slow and agonizing. Authorities focused on rural areas in Arizona and New Mexico where people frequently lived off the grid, places without cameras, formal addresses, or even reliable cell signals. Aerial scans of remote stretches of land revealed small encampments, trailers hidden in brush, and scattered solar panels. Most were innocent, survivalist communities or isolated individuals. But investigators believed Daniel and Luke could be among them, blending into a population that rarely asked questions. Melissa was kept informed, but each day, without progress, wore her down. The idea that Luke had been raised in secret, outside the world, without schooling, without her, filled her with sorrow. What kind of life had he lived? Had he believed she was dead, or worse? Had he been taught to forget her altogether? Then, another envelope arrived at an return address, just like the first. This time, it contained a single photo, a campfire glowing in the dim light of dusk, surrounded by dry brush and a rocky slope. Sitting near the fire was a young man, thin, long-haired, hunched over, staring directly into the camera. His eyes were unmistakable. It was Luke, older now, his features sharper, his body lean and hardened. But it was him. There was no note this time, just the photograph. The message, though, was clear. Someone wanted Melissa to keep looking. Analysts studied the terrain in the photo and used satellite imaging to match the background rock formation to a region in western Nevada near an abandoned mining road. A team was dispatched to the area, hiking into a rugged, sun-scorched terrain. It took 2 days, but they found what they were looking for, a makeshift shelter built into a shallow rock cavity. It was covered with camouflage netting and surrounded by buckets, water jugs, and the shell of an old solar panel. Inside, the space was cramped and dusty. 2 sleeping bags lay side by side on the ground. There were empty food cans, some weathered books, and a rusted hunting knife. But the most important find was a small notebook stuffed behind a crate. The pages were worn and curled, many soaked with water damage, but some were legible. The entries were brief and scattered, written in a young hand. They were signed LW at the bottom. The content confirmed what Melissa feared. Luke had been kept in hiding, taught to distrust the outside world, and raised to believe his mother had died. In one entry, he wrote about overhearing his father's voice crack when talking about the past. Another entry read, "He says people will take me away if they find us. Says mom's gone. I don't believe him anymore." The most chilling line came near the final page. "If this is my only way out, I hope someone finds this." Daniel was not at the site. Authorities believed he had left Luke alone for a short period, possibly for a supply run. They began surveilling nearby roads, gas stations, and convenience stores. The IT didn't take long. 2 days later, a man matching Daniel's age description entered a gas station 20 miles from the site. He used cash, wore sunglasses, and spoke very little. But a state trooper recognized the photo from the bulletin and detained him as he exited the store. Fingerprints confirmed the truth. It was Daniel Wyatt, alive after 12 years, with a new name, a forged ID, and a fabricated history. Luke was found just hours later in a nearby clearing, alone and disoriented. He didn't resist when approached, but his responses were limited. He didn't ask for his father. He didn't mention his mother. Authorities said he looked exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He had been surviving in a world that offered no choice, no escape, and no truth. Melissa was flown in to meet him under supervision. When she saw Luke, now a grown man, she broke down. He looked at her as if she were a stranger. And in many ways, she was. The last time they had seen each other, he had been a child. Now, he was 22, shaped by a reality built on lies. Daniel refused to speak during initial questioning. His silence only deepened the mystery of why he had done it, why he had stolen a child's life, vanished into obscurity, and left behind a woman to mourn a husband and son who were never truly gone. Daniel sat in an interrogation room for hours, refusing to answer any questions. His expression was calm, almost detached, as if he had convinced himself that what he had done made sense. The FBI, local authorities, and federal prosecutors wanted to know one thing. Why? Why fake a drowning? Why steal his son's identity, his childhood, his future? Why vanish for 12 years, dragging a child into a hidden life? He finally spoke on the second day. According to him, the decision to disappear was not sudden. He claimed he had been under tremendous pressure, financial, emotional, and professional. He said he feared losing custody of Luke after a series of arguments with Melissa that he insisted had escalated behind closed doors. But investigators quickly found no evidence to support that narrative. Melissa had never filed for divorce, never contacted a lawyer, and no custody dispute had ever been recorded. In fact, everyone who knew the couple described them as stable, even boring. What Daniel painted was a fictional justification. The truth, unearthed by a deeper investigation, was far more troubling. Before the disappearance, Daniel had been quietly funneling money through shell accounts. He had manipulated shipping invoices at the logistics company where he worked and pocketed the difference. Classic white-collar fraud. An internal audit had begun just weeks before the canoeing trip. He likely knew that legal consequences were coming. If exposed, he could lose his job, his reputation, and possibly face jail time. To Daniel, the solution wasn't confession. It was erasure, but escaping alone wasn't enough. He took Luke with him, possibly to ensure no one would suspect him of fleeing, possibly out of a twisted desire to keep his son isolated and dependent. Luke had been a leverage point, a shield and a companion in Daniel's new world of deception. He became the center of Daniel's constructed reality, the only person who mattered. Over the years, Daniel taught him that the world was dangerous, that his mother had died, that they were fugitives from people who wanted to tear them apart. He raised Luke on lies as much as survival skills. Authorities described Luke's situation as a missing person in plain sight. He had lived for over a decade in the shadows of desert lands, far from education, healthcare, or any real social contact. He had been homeschooled with outdated books and taught to stay away from strangers. Every time they moved, Daniel changed their names. Luke became Caleb, then Nathan, then Eli. The consistency was fear, isolation, and obedience. Back at the safe house where Luke had been taken, psychologists and trauma specialists began working with him carefully. He was quiet at first, barely engaging. He showed signs of emotional blunting, a survival mechanism developed over years of suppression. The outside world was overwhelming. He didn't understand how to use a phone, had never watched television, and had never interacted with anyone his own age. The only voice he had known for years was his father's. Melissa was allowed to visit under strict supervision. The reunion was not what she had imagined in her long nights of prayer and hope. Luke didn't run into her arms. He didn't smile or cry. He looked at her with a numb curiosity, unsure whether to believe she was real. Trauma specialists warned Melissa not to take it personally. Luke had been raised to believe she no longer existed. To him, she was a ghost from a life he barely remembered. Still, Melissa refused to give up. She attended every session she was allowed to join, bringing photos, stories, and old keepsakes. She showed him his childhood drawings, his favorite toys, even the blue jacket he wore the last day they saw each other. Slowly, something shifted. Luke began asking questions. He wanted to know what she did after they disappeared, if she ever stopped looking. He was beginning to realize his life had been built on lies, not just about her, but about the world. Daniel, meanwhile, was officially charged with multiple felonies: parental kidnapping, wire fraud, insurance fraud, identity theft, and child endangerment. His attorney tried to argue diminished capacity and fear of prosecution, but the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel had planned the disappearance with precision. This wasn't a man fleeing danger. It was a man escaping accountability. Dragging an innocent child along. In court, Daniel showed no remorse. He gave a brief statement about doing what he thought was best. The judge called his actions selfish, calculated, and cruel. The jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. As for Luke, his recovery was only just beginning. Physically free, yes, but emotionally and psychologically, he faced a long journey. Melissa stood by him, no longer just a mother in mourning, but now a mother with hope. After 12 stolen years, she had found her son, and now she had to help him find himself. The courtroom fell silent as the judge handed down the sentence. 30 years in federal prison with no chance of parole for the first 15. Daniel Wyatt stood motionless, eyes fixed ahead, as if the words barely touched him. He had stolen 12 years from his wife, his son, and a life he once lived. Now, time would be taken from him. Melissa sat in the front row, holding a tissue in one hand and a photo of Luke as a boy in the other. She didn't feel victorious. There was no celebration in justice, only a strange emptiness, like finding the end of a terrible story that left more questions than answers. Luke did not attend the sentencing. He had been given the option but chose to remain in therapy, surrounded by professionals trying to guide him through a world he barely knew. In the months following his recovery, Luke had taken small steps. He learned to use a smartphone cautiously, joined social media under a private account, and began working with a trauma counselor who specialized in long-term isolation cases. His adjustment was difficult. The outside world was overwhelming, noisy, fast, unpredictable. For someone raised in silence and secrecy, even basic interactions were hard to process. He rarely spoke about his father. When asked, he simply said, "He taught me how to disappear." It wasn't angry or bitter. It was just a fact. Daniel had trained him to fear the world, and now Luke had to unlearn everything he had been told. He had to discover who he really was without the shadow of his father shaping every decision. Melissa moved into a small apartment near the rehabilitation center. She didn't want to pressure Luke into living with her. She knew she couldn't. Just step back into the role of mother, not after so many lost years. But she was there every day. She brought home-cooked meals, photo albums, and books he used to love as a child. Sometimes he accepted them. Sometimes he didn't. Their conversations were cautious at first, limited to weather, food, and the occasional memory. Then, one day, he asked about his 10th birthday party, the last one before everything changed. It was the first time he reached backward on his own. From that day on, something shifted. They started taking walks together. Luke enrolled in a GED program. He showed interest in photography and was given a digital camera. For someone who had lived in hiding, capturing the world on his own terms felt empowering. He liked stillness, mountains, sunsets, faces deep in thought. Slowly, he was building a new identity, one that wasn't based on fear or lies. Meanwhile, details continued to emerge from Daniel's notebooks and financial records. Investigators discovered that during their years in hiding, Daniel had occasionally posed as a wilderness guide, offering private off-grid tours to wealthy survivalists. He operated under false names and dealt only in cash. That's how he supported their life, through deceit layered upon deceit. At no point had he tried to contact Melissa. No message, no hint of remorse. He had fully committed to a new life, where she didn't exist. The mystery of who sent the photographs remained partially unsolved. The FBI traced the envelopes to a mailbox in Nevada, but the trail went cold. Melissa suspected it had been Luke. Maybe he had waited for the right moment to signal for help. Maybe that photograph by the fire had been staged. But when she asked him gently one afternoon, he looked at her and simply said, "I hoped someone would find us." That was all he offered, but it was enough that a year after Daniel's sentencing, Luke stood beside Melissa at a quiet memorial by Clatsop Lake, the same lake where their lives had split in two. Melissa placed a white flower in the water, not for Daniel, but for the years lost. Luke stood silently, camera hanging around his neck, watching the ripple disappear into the mist. They were no longer trapped by the past. The truth had finally come out. Daniel was behind bars. Luke was finding his voice. And Melissa, once broken by grief, now held on to something else, possibility. It would take time, maybe years, to build what had been lost. But the healing had begun, not with words, not with justice, but with presence. Together, they walked away from the lake, not as mother and child reuniting after a day apart, but as two survivors of a story far stranger than fiction, finally on the path forward.